Thank you so much, Annabelle. So good morning, everybody. I better look at you without my glasses on. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of this land that we meet on here and pay my respect to elders present, past and future, as they hold the memories and traditions of their people. As I walked along the river this morning and I looked at the contrast between the mangroves and the concrete, I reminded myself of the asphalt upon which I was walking, that this land is and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm just wondering, one of the lines from this song, which was chosen by Tom, a student in Year 10, who is dealing with voices, when he came into my office, I asked him, well, you know, what music could we play? And this was the song that he chose. And so you can imagine that this was the starting point of the conversation I had with him. And I was kind of a bit aghast because I thought, wow, what a song to start for this plenary when we're talking about memory and trauma and gendered violence. And I suppose I'm wondering, which memories would you like the people that you consult with to hold on to? Don't forget my notes here. What I've shaped this practice plenary around is this quote from Michael White, who informed many of my ideas. How can we ensure that children are not vulnerable to an experience of re-traumatisation in the context of speaking about what they have been through? Okay. Before I go on with this, I've got a request for you today. You'll see on your tables that there are some sticky notes and a whole lot of other paraphernalia there. As you listen to this plenary, for those of you that would want to, could you jot down your ideas that you hear that might strike a chord with your practice, that you think might actually contribute to the work that you're doing with families and children and the people that you consult with? And then the words that you write down will be collected by me at the end of this presentation, and I'm actually going to deliver them back to the people that have helped inform this speech or this talk, okay? So to the students and the families whose stories I share. So this practice is called a taking it back practice, which in itself provides people who have lived with the effects of violence a sense of acknowledgement, to know that in some ways that they might be contributing to the innovations that you're making in your practice. As a result of hearing just snippets about their lives, they're not positioned or objectified, but in fact, what you hear is actually taken into your work. You know, this is an agreement that I have with the young people and the families whose part of their stories I'm going to be sharing with you today. So it's only for those of you that would like to do that, that would be wonderful. Okay. So what I'd like to do before I move on is really acknowledge you. And this is a very well-known quote from Leonard Cohen. There's a crack in everything, that's where the light gets in. And it's very apt for you, an audience linked with shared intentions to reduce the prevalence of gendered violence. So I'd like to acknowledge the years of collective experience that you bring. No doubt you've brought or been able to bring forward a sense of light or ways for people to reconnect with their own skills and knowledge to get them through uninvited trauma. I'd like to also acknowledge what it's taken for you to be present here today for these days, the multitude of things that you've had to arrange and put aside or delegate to other people. I'd also like to acknowledge the networks that you've built, the people that you rely upon to keep your skills rigorous and accountable, your supervisors, your mentors, your mates. And especially, I'd like to acknowledge those of us attending who have lived experience of these injustices, because your presence here today and yesterday no doubt reflects a commitment that you have for the safer lives and the best interactions that people can have with practitioners for those navigating the effects of trauma. So let me continue with a story from Bev, who wanted me to learn from her hard-won experiences. Okay. I suppose in your practice, there are always interactions with clients that you come away with feeling changed by. This is one of them. With Bev's permission, I'll share this story. A while back, and I'm talking maybe 8 years ago, I invited a woman who was a new client into my office, which at the time was at a place called Murray Bridge, a rural centre about 100 kilometres from Adelaide. I came to discover quite quickly that Bev wasn't there for that counselling or therapy, that Western psychological construct that positions that positions people in need rather than coming in with knowledge. Bev made it very clear to me that she'd heard that we ran an anger management group for men, and she wanted to know what happens in them now, because you see, she wanted to tell me that her cherished son had just been charged with assault and he had to attend one of those groups. She said, "I'm not convinced that it'll work. It didn't for his dad. It was a shame job." Oh dear. Sorry, I knew this had happened. "I don't want this for my boy, but I can't stop it." Her son was so much more than anger that just needed to be managed. She wanted dignity for her son. As his loved mother, she had been the recipient of some of these assaults. And Bev went on to describe her son Michael was an apprentice, an uncle, a footy coach for the under-8s, a mate, at times a kid going down the wrong road, but he was also a Ghana man with responsibilities. Bev didn't know that I was also co-facilitating a men's group. I had a white leadership view of what went on and what we hoped for. With her request, I felt many of my roles converging, in terms of the invitation she made to me for dignity for her son. Being a counsellor with adolescents in a school, sometimes angry young men, who were also many other things, loving, smart and funny. I was also working with dads who had violated their once-loved female partners. I was also consulting with other female partners and mothers who were terrified that their kids would be damaged for life. I was meeting with grandparents who cared for their grandkids because violence or the injustice of forced removal had rearranged the care responsibilities that were preferred. In answering Bev's request for what goes on in those groups, I knew I wasn't there to convince her that Uniting Communities men's groups would be the answer for managing this anger thing. What I did want to make time for her was letting her know that due to women's feedback, we made a point of inviting men to consider the helpful and unhelpful ways that shame can operate. And I knew that if I was to see any man just as violent, it would risk the experience that Bev had had. Or men, because what would happen men would see the group as a waste of time, or just participated in a tick the box, I've attended enough weeks, see you later way. So I carry that influence from Bev with me very significantly. In my practice, I try to hold a really constant vigilance to not ask questions or do things that might bring shame to young people, partners and men. This is an evolving skill that I learned to hone from the women, the young women and the men that give me pretty straight feedback. I also learned this skill from my wonderful teammates at Uniting Communities and from the writings and teachings I've been lucky enough to have access to from Alan Jenkins and Michael White, and the women and particularly the people that consulted and influenced them. So what else do we know that suits the people most affected by gendered violence? I'd like you now to listen to Cara, who's consulting with a colleague of mine, Terry, at Uniting Communities, and she very generously said she was happy to tell a little bit of her story. So let's see how this goes. Whoops, you missed the Lunic cartoon. Okay.
It has been a very important part of my journey to surround myself with people who acknowledge my feelings and provide me with a sense of being heard. This extends to not only family and friends, but also the wide range of workers who I've come into contact with. Coming out of an abusive relationship, it has been extremely important for my sense of self-worth to not be told how I should feel and move forward. Within a week of fleeing the house with our children, we needed to get safe phones and were directed to Louise Place. I just expected to turn up and collect phones, but the lovely worker there discreetly asked how I was doing, and it opened a floodgate of emotion. Without another word and without prying anymore, this worker, along with others, started to fill the back of my car with food, blankets, a kettle and toaster, and even crockery and cutlery from their own kitchen. This simple act touched me beyond words, and I have never forgotten this non-judgmental and selfless approach. I was overwhelmed in a good way. This was one of my first steps in acknowledging that I had definitely done the right thing by leaving, and others understood and supported me. Our family lawyer keeps saying, "You need to let the house contents go and just move on." Sometimes I feel if I hear this one more time, I'm going to explode. So, my advice, don't keep telling someone to move on and to let go. They know this already and will do it in their own time. One standout experience has been the willingness of the boys' counsellor to be flexible in his approach to engaging with them. One day, our youngest child was extremely distressed and overwhelmed and would not get out of the car to attend a counselling session. Instead of postponing the session, the counsellor said, "How would the boys feel if I come over to where the car was parked?" I said, "I think they would see it as a caring act." The counsellor said, "It's difficult enough for children to talk about what's happened in an unfamiliar environment, let alone to someone they've only met twice." A subsequent session was held at Adelaide Central Market over yoga and coffee that enabled the children to feel more at ease, where the counsellor was asking the boys all sorts of questions about Minecraft. Personal items are still being withheld from the children by their dad. The eldest child had an interstate school camp and was being refused his suitcase and felt his dad was stealing from him. Our well-meaning lawyer told me to just go buy a new one. This is all well and good, but the lawyer did not understand the meaning behind the suitcase. The lawyer said, "If you keep asking for it and it's not being given, it will put your son under more stress." So this phrase felt like I was to blame for my son to not have the suitcase, like I was the bad guy. The focus was on me rather than on his dad, who wasn't giving the boys their things. I hope other women come into contact with workers who hear them, truly hear them. I want women to be surrounded with people who help them realise that they are not responsible for their ex-partner's actions and behaviours. I hope they are given options and allowed time to make their own decisions, knowing their own experiences are valid and be confident in what they do is in the best interests of children involved. I am being harassed on a weekly basis by the father when he telephones to speak with the children. I've had enough of it. The counsellor gently suggested that I let the father know that if he wishes to engage in respectful talk, then I'm up for it. But if the blaming and harassing talk continues, that is not okay, and I will end the call. I felt that what I wanted to say to my ex-partner was acknowledged by the counsellor, and I was helped with how to say it, but in a way that it was my choice as to when I felt okay to say it.
Okay, so there might be some of Kara's words may resonate with what you already know helps people you work with. One theme that always stands out with me is how our practices can instill dignity. How might we invite really familiar stories into the room without discounting but certainly disrupting the unfamiliarity of the trauma experience? How might I do this though when I was confronted with this kind of introduction? One day from reception, I was rung by our receptionist and she said to me, "I've booked you extra time because the mum's in a wheelchair. Her husband broke a leg. She's coming in with her daughters." Referrals or first descriptions are often presented as very thin conclusions of people's lives. Allocation meetings, a call from reception that unintentionally positions mothers and children as victims, and fathers as perpetrators. We need to be really careful, as you'd know, of these identity conclusions, as they can limit us and are confining of people that we consult. As Trudy in her presentation yesterday spoke about, we really need to attend to language. So you can imagine when I received this description, how much this woman's two daughters, Amy and Hannah, would be looking forward to this thing called counselling. In their holidays, thank you very much. When their lives were shrouded in shame and uncertainty, and they're about to meet a stranger, me, who's probably going to ask all sorts of intrusive questions and make assumptions about their still beloved dad. Okay, so when the endeavour to help seems like a daunting responsibility, I find over the years, and it's taken me a while to kind of really get this, what helps me is to really think about all the unknown history of skills and knowledge that this family will have when they first meet with us. So for me, and probably you, rarely is the conversational starting point the trauma. What's more important is to build like a platform of safety, a place for people to stand that is more known and familiar, to enable them to access their own skills and knowledge that could be helpful at a time that is far from known and familiar. Okay. So many of you that might practice narrative ideas, this metaphor may be familiar. It's called the riverbank position, and it was named by a worker in Zimbabwe. Finding a safe and dignified conversational place, this is what it is. It's finding a safe and dignified conversational place for people to stand when they're in the midst of trauma, compared to the rushing, flooding river that has slimy stones and you can never get a grip on it, like trauma. This means I'm often quite insistent to speak about the everyday of life, what is known and familiar when I meet with people and young people at school. I might even politely interrupt the story of what was done to them, the trauma story. Because sometimes with dominant discourses of counselling, people might feel that they have to tell it, to get it out, to get through it. But what we know is that this can be highly re-traumatising of people. So we'd hate those sort of dominant ideas to kind of crash in at that time. So I often come to hear about other things going on in life, as many of you may already know when you're working in communities and you know families. Other things that make them up, the multiple stories of identity, things outside of the trauma. So what I did with this mum, who was wheeled into my office by her darling girls, I asked her, I know there are some hard things that have happened that have got in the way of how you'd like life to be. We can talk about some of that. Today is a session where you can really suss me out. Now, of course, that's happening, and I think that's a really important thing, that people are sussing you out, because sometimes people think this is the only way that counselling can be done. And we know there's a whole multitude of ways that therapy and counselling can be done. And this is also addressing those relations of power. You know, they're in a position of consultant. They're checking out, what is this place like? And then I often might, particularly at Uniting Communities on a Friday, when sometimes it's not incredibly busy, I might say, it's really quiet in here. This may seem like a bit of an odd question, but could we play some of your favourite music? What have you got on your playlist or on Spotify? Just imagine like we're really bringing the known and familiar into the room. We're not discounting the trauma, but as Jackie was talking about before, maybe that's going to put their brains online, really inviting their worlds into the room in a non-condescending but very respectful way. And just in playing music, as you listen to moments at the beginning of today, there was so much I could ask Tom about, why he chose this, what was it that he liked about it. And sometimes he'll say, I don't know, I just like it, And how did he decide? I mean, he could have chosen anything. He could have shown some screamo music and I might have been in a bit of a dilemma then, But he actually showed that one. So, As I just mentioned before, this narrative term, life and identity, is always multi-storied. Asking about these events and even music that they're into provides a context for hearing about maybe preferred stories, that we can be listening for skills and knowledge that may help people to connect back to values that have been almost erased or questioned by the trauma, disturbed by the trauma. So obviously, I'd never start with the question, what happened to you? I'm asking about what's easy, what's known and familiar territory. So back to Amy and Hannah, the daughters of Trudy, and the music I played. What I found out about these girls and their mum was a rich account of lives lived alongside the atrocities of violence. People that we consult with deserve to be known, of course, more fully than just in relation to gendered violence. And this idea of multi-storied identity is vital, also with those who perpetrate this violence. So what I was wanting to bring forward for this family were skills and knowledges embedded in social relationships and culture, events that can be more easily spoken about. These questions and this knowledge begins to build that steady riverbank by upholding a sense of dignity and bringing a richer account of a mother's life, a child's life, and a father's life. These spoken stories help to rebuild links into that autobiographic or narrative memory system that was spoken about yesterday, that has been disrupted by the trauma. Simple, everyday questions that you'd be asking as well. You know, like, what might you usually be doing on a Wednesday? And if it's the holidays, the answer's usually sleeping, you know. What's the most boring thing you do at school? Who else lives with you? What would be your favourite day if you had one? How do you fill in your time? You know, and obviously different questions for adults. It was during these tellings that the girls introduced their father, who perpetrated these assaults towards their mother and them, as their netball coach and a great birthday cake maker. This was dignity in action. This is so much more than rapport building. As they spoke of other events, I was also listening for actions that help them to get through challenges that have nothing to do with the trauma. Losing a grand final at netball, not being picked in the team because you're the coach's daughter. Ways of remembering a beloved pet dog who just died. Knowing how to listen to the Triple J Hottest 100 when there were dark times happening. In addition to this at school, where I meet with adolescents, I invite young people to connect with other stories of getting through hard times. I do this in a slightly different way. This is what my rather shambolic office looks like at St John's Grammar. On 2 walls, I've placed personal documents or messages detailing knowledge that has come from conversations I've had with young people. Messages that they think might help others. Some of these are on your tables, and they've given me permission to share them today. This practice is linked to many philosophical intentions to do with ideas of modern power, in which knowledge has more space to exist or to be circulated or given credit. A primary intention is also a stand against Western individualism. Having these knowledges on the walls links and collectivises experience. It's documented proof, publicly showing to students that their lives are linked to others, not only by Facebook, but the old-fashioned written word. However, I'm not telling them to put them up on the wall. I'm not forcing them to write it down. When they come into my room, they're choosing the phrases from the wall that might resonate with their own experiences. So I might say to a young person that when they first come in, have a look at this crazy room. It's not at all like a classroom. Choose a phrase or a picture that stands out. It might just sound familiar or a bit odd, or you just might like it. So, in addition to asking them what their favourite music is, they just have a good look at what's on the wall. Some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them just sit down and start talking, but a lot of them really do have a good close look. Okay. So a lot of the knowledges that are on the wall are very different to posters that might say the 10 best ways to build self-esteem, or what to do when confidence is down, you know. These are subjugated knowledges. These are knowledges of lived experience that aren't usually published in books, but they should be, that aren't on signs around schools, but they should be. So by having students read these messages that resonate, as Michael White describes, people experience themselves as linked to others around shared values. These insider knowledges enable students and their friends and families to start to witness how others have grappled with hard times. I might also ask, once they've sat down and chosen a phrase, what do you think it took for this other student to know that? They're at once positioned as discerning commentators, guessing what skills the other person may have had to use, which is often much easier than having to talk about their own experience, which Western individualism might steer us towards. So asking them about the skills through the eyes of someone else is far more accessible. And these are things they've chosen that resonate in their own life. These realisations that they've actually used skills to get through may reinvigorate associations to memories of actions and values they have used to respond to the effects of trauma they are experiencing. As I mentioned before, this is a significantly different starting point than asking what happened. Yeah, so how do I actually get young people to create these documents? And what it is, it's about listening for what people know. You know, it's a special kind of listening. Let's have a closer look at this one. I don't think I put this one on the table, or did I? Did anyone read this? You did? Yeah, good, okay. So I thought this was particularly relevant, and a lot of kids choose this one. I don't know if you can see the yellow writing. Advice for divorced parents. Sometimes Dad tries to make Mum look like a bad person, but she's not. Dad's a good person too. I shouldn't have to deal with Mum and Dad's bitch fighting. It's mainly Dad. Mum's happy for Dad. He's never happy for Mum. It sucks to hear Dad be so rude to someone who's raising me and doing a good job of it. He needs to stop and get over it. For a 50-year-old, he's 3. So how did I get to this point though? You know, like... for Marisha, who wrote this, after having a few conversations about her favourite music, her photography and her new part-time job at Macca's, she began to tell me about the effects of violence she was living with. She told me about the bitch fighting that came from her dad to her mum and how she'd been positioned as the messenger. Without wanting to shame her due to the actions of her dad, I said something like, look, I know you're telling me these things about Mum and Dad, and I don't want you to think that I'm just going to sum your mum or your dad up as just all bad or all good, you know, because parents can be kind of lots of things at the same time. They can be good, annoying, and even terrifying too. She nodded her head when I said that, and looking down, that's when she went on to describe how Dad tries to make Mum look like a bad person. Now, we don't know what the meaning of that is. So as she spoke, I wrote down her words. I asked her then some questions that picked up on the action that she was taking in response to this unfairness. So these are the questions that you can see. How do you keep that in your head, that Dad's a good person too, when the bitch fighting's going on? What might knowing he's good too help with? What do you think other separating parents should know about? What would you hope adults divorcing or separating would learn if we wrote down your ideas? Because I meet with parents as well. How do you think it might help other kids to know about this when their parents were going through conflict? So you can see how I was just really pulling forward her skills and knowledges rather than asking about the effects of the trauma. This is a very different positioning of people, okay? And of course, you know, for her to know that this hard-won knowledge and experience might contribute to other kids that she knows, she said, yeah, I'll write it, and off she went, you know. And so I wasn't exactly sure what she was going to write down, but that's what came out. So let's have a look at this in relation to Hannah and her sister and their mum, who'd been wheeled into my office. So having been introduced to their dad, this is Hannah and Amy's dad, as their netball coach, and the best birthday cake maker, I began to hear the story of the assault he committed. And this is what Amy described. Hang on. Mum and Dad were arguing. We then heard this thump. I got Amy and we ran down to see what had happened. Dad was kind of over Mum, and I jumped on top of him and I started hitting him and I told him, stop. Okay. So we're listening for skills and knowledge. Very easy to be invited into thinking about what the trauma did to her. I can remember when I made a report to Families SA and I told them that she was involved in the kind of assault, in jumping on her dad. They said, oh, well, that notches it up a level in terms of trauma. And I'm thinking, well, there's an interesting approach, isn't it? You know, to position the child as traumatised. I'm not suggesting they're not. But I was very mindful that I wasn't being asked about the action that the child took. Now, we might sit here and go, isn't that awful that a child's had to intervene? But what we have to be thinking about is what are the skills and knowledge that enabled her to assess that that was all right to do at the time, you know. Okay, so, So when we ask about the intentions behind actions that aren't so routinely asked about, we start to place people in the territory of safety rather than the territory of trauma. These are some examples, just snippets from the conversation I had from her. These are different inquiries that tend to promote dignity rather than shame, action taken rather than what the trauma did to them, and are also invigorating for us as workers as they reconnect people to what's precious and what they hope for in their lives. So I asked her, what were you kind of supporting by running down to Mum together? She ran down with her sister. So I'm asking about her intentions. And I said, what do you reckon was utmost of, and then I asked her younger sister, what do you reckon was of utmost importance for Hannah to be able to do these things to try and stop Dad? What might it have taken? Okay, let's see. What do you think, then I asked their mum, what do you think it took for the girls to do these things? I'm not suggesting that trying to stop their dad was right or wrong, but I'm interested in what that tells you about what your daughters value, okay? I don't think Westerners are that kind of practiced at asking about values. We're very practiced at asking about what happened, action. So it's kind of a skill that I'm still learning about. Their mum said, it's kind of right and wrong, but they were sticking up for me. What he did was not the best, in fact bad. She said a lot more than that. I know this is a particular time, but are there other situations where they do this sticking up for others? Okay. So what I'm doing here is I'm starting to build a story about this value that I've heard, sticking up for others, and I'm moving away from the trauma because I'm building that riverbank position. And their mum said, this is an edited transcript of course, justice and fairness has always been important to Hannah. She sees someone's doing something wrong and she'll tell them. It can be bloody embarrassing, she said. So then I said, could you tell me another story about something even funny or embarrassing that Hannah did to stick up for fairness? So I'm, building this story. And their mum said, sure, what about the one about the old man? So then I heard this story about they stopped at a bus stop because it was a man that they saw quite often not far from their home, and Hannah said, oh, there he is again, Mum, and they asked if he wanted a lift, and he was going quite close to where they lived, and they gave him a lift home. Okay. So then I asked about supportive audiences, once again, a stand against individualism, to kind of bring forward the social and relational histories of these people. So where might Hannah have gained that ability from to stick up for fairness? Both of the girls looked at their mum. From Mum, they said together. Who else might know about this, that this value of sticking up for others is important to Hannah? And then they said, oh, Gran and Pop know. So we're filling the room with lots of people and lots of supportive audiences. Okay. So at this point, I kind of found out, this led me to hear about another event. I'm just going to go back a minute. This led me to hear about another event that the girls may not have told me if all they thought that I knew about their dad was that he'd committed the assault. Okay? Remember, I'd been introduced to him as their coach and their best birthday cake maker. The shaming event was that girls had been asked by their dad not to tell their pop and gran that he'd broken their mum's ankle. You'd be very familiar with these acts of silencing. With the girls' permission, this theme of silencing was attended to. As down the track, their father began to attend a group for men who had taken abusive actions and had used violence. In this group, accountability practices have us always weaving themes that children and partners or ex-partners raise with counsellors into discussions with the men. Now, of course, we're extremely careful about that in terms of safety, so we won't do it if it will obviously identify a family member or increase risk. But, you know, the theme of silencing others is a kind of pretty mandatory theme in the men's groups that we're running. You know, these questions were based around the effects of shame, you know, through the philosophy of invitational practices that you're going to be hearing probably a lot more about this afternoon from Alan. In this instance, the men were asked something like this. Men have told us about the times when shame has got them telling their kids or family to be quiet about the violence. Okay, so what might that be like for the kids? What might that risk in terms of how you want them to see you? So men are invited to contemplate how these actions fit, or usually, hopefully, transgress the values that they hold. For example, about the kind of father they're striving to be. And as I said before, this work is strongly informed by the people that have Alan Jenkins has consulted. These are incredibly ethical and invitational ideas. So often in the face of violence, women and children tell us that they do nothing, they freeze. This would be a familiar story to you. So I'd like to share an account of this and how listening for action in nothing can be possible. So what I'm going to do is go back to when I asked Amy, the younger sister, before she ran down with her older sister and tried to stop Dad. So I said to Amy, "So when you heard this thump, Amy, what did you do?" And Amy said, "I did nothing, I hid behind the couch." So I kind of get reminded about this idea that people are always responding to crises, even when they're relatively powerless to escape that context. So as I said before, this is not an unusual response. I froze, I did nothing, I couldn't do anything, I was terrified. But we can still ask into that. Otherwise, the story of the impact of trauma remains, and people are more likely to be just positioned as passive recipients to trauma, rather than agentive or being able to take action. Okay. So you hid. How did you think of that? I don't know, I was scared. So then I said to her mum, "What are you guessing Amy was protecting by doing that?" So I'm asking a skill for those that know about narrative practices. This is a remembering skill, asking about audience. Her mum said, "It's good, I'm pleased she did it. I would have." Then I said, "What might have you been saying to yourself, Amy, when this was happening?" So I'm asking about her thinking and her intentions. And Amy said, "I had to go and see if Mum was all right." "What was important to you at the time?" And she said, "I didn't want Hannah to go down on her own." Okay. So asking about actions and intentions leads us to a very different place where people are positioned as agentive and not just survivors of violence. So as I shared with you earlier, these actions and knowledges can be documented as they were with Amy and Hannah. So just to fast forward a little bit as I come to the end of this presentation, about 6 months down the track, they talked to me about a description of their father, who had actually still been living, and I know this is certainly not the case for many situations, but he had still been living in the home. They wrote this document. They talked to me about Dad, he's a dad who's not a dad. And I asked them, "What do you mean? Is that good or not so good or a bit of both?" "It's good, but I know now that I know that Dad now knows he's done something wrong. So he'd been attending the group, and that wasn't an easy transition, and sometimes that doesn't happen. And it's not just because of the group, there are a whole lot of other situations that were going on for them. How might you notice that this is a bit of both? And she said to me, he's not moping, he actually told Nan and Pop. The way he's making it a bit better for Mum makes him a dad, like going for walks around the block when he's getting mad, not losing it. He was horrible before it happened. He's still both a dad and not a dad. So then out of this came this document, and some of the questions, this is what it says. When your dad's not being bad, remember the okay stuff. When your dad's being bad, remember the okay stuff. I remember he's a good coach. He still tells dad jokes, but he was shit to Mum. He felt bad, that's good. Only tell some stuff to close friends. This is about who would you tell about this. He's a bit of a dad, but not a real dad yet. So this dilemma of, that we have when children often love and hate the same person, this is not unusual, is it? And we can work with this. So some of the questions I asked about this is what makes it important to remember the okay stuff about Dad? Where did you get the idea to only tell close friends? Another skill. Who else would think these ideas would be pretty good? So similar to before. Do you think if another person your age knew these things, it might help? Can we document this knowledge? Okay. So constantly listening for skills and knowledge and getting them to share this skill and knowledge with others so they're positioned as a consultant. Okay, so outside of the counselling room, the girls were attending a school where they were part of a group called the Justice and Mercy Group, and it was in this group that they were kind of learning about different forms of violence. And in fact, the youngest daughter kind of alerted their mum to saying, "Mum, you're being emotionally abused," and it was due to her insistence that that their mum took some different action. So in hearing about this story, and also in my other job working at a school, knowing how vital school communities are and what part they can play in the protection of children, I asked them more about the teacher that taught them this and how she went about it. Not surprisingly, she was one of their favourite teachers. So I asked them if it would be all right if I would write a letter to the school, letting the principal know, because sometimes principals don't know, about the grassroots kind of action that was going on in the school to promote safety. So I did that, and I think possibly because I'm also working in school, I kind of made an insistent request that the letter was read out at a staff meeting, and the girls weren't identified, but the letter just sort of highlighted how some wonderful input at school had meant that, and not that girls should be responsible for this or children should be responsible, but it actually led to some very kind of vital social action that happened. Okay, so before we just end, I'd just like you to have a bit of a think and a talk to the people at your table about what stood out to you or what struck a chord. And if you've got any messages that you'd like to send back to this family or to Tom, who introduced us to this, or to any of the students that might have written some of these messages, that would be really terrific if you could let them know how what you've heard might contribute to your practices. And you might want to just put your name and where you live on it, because that can be incredibly significant as well. It's not mandatory, but it would be a very beautiful and generous act. So just in finishing, I'd like to summarise to remind you that you're the people that have this responsibility to bring forward the light in people's lives, their skills and knowledges, and that we can do this by listening not only to the trauma but also to their skills and knowledges, to the action that they can take. And we do that by providing a kind of, safe ground to stand on, which many of you will already be doing when you're part of a community and you know so much about their lives. And embedded in that it's an incredibly ethical and supportive way to go about it. I think it really keeps me in the work that I'm doing, to be able to bring forward non-traumatising memories. So thank you for listening.